The night creatures were already awake when he pulled onto the gravel, their voices weaving through the darkness like a warning. Ray had grown up with those sounds, frogs croaking low, cicadas buzzing in restless waves, the distant cry of an owl. But tonight the chorus felt unsettled, as if the forest itself sensed why he'd come. He stayed inside the truck longer than he meant to. The engine ticked as it cooled, the windows fogging slightly in the damp heat. Across the yard, the old metal shed waited like a secret he could never outrun. 5 acres of forgotten land lay behind him, wrapped in pine trees thick enough to block the nearest neighbor, who lived 2 miles down a washed-out dirt road no one bothered to grade anymore. Ray had bought this place more than a decade earlier with cash, no questions, no paperwork that tied anything back to his real life. Even the deed belonged to a man who had never existed outside Ray's imagination. The mailbox in Biloxi received the taxes. The utility company didn't know the land had been touched by human hands. The water came from a well he dug himself. Waste went into a hole in the earth. No addresses, no meters, no visitors. That was the point. The shed rose from a concrete pad he poured during a blistering July week, sweat dripping off his jaw as he mixed cement and scraped it smooth until the floor gleamed. Corrugated steel wrapped the rest, trapping heat so fiercely that midsummer afternoons turned the interior into a furnace. But Ray didn't mind. Heat helped. It kept the mixture inside the drums alive, prevented the fatty parts from turning solid and sticking to the drains. A cooler room made the process messy, evidence leaking messy. He stepped out of the truck. The night pressed close around him. The frogs thrummed. The owl called again. Nothing human, not for miles. Ray opened the shed door and tugged the pull chain hanging from the rafters. A single bulb buzzed to life, dim, jaundiced, barely stronger than a candle. Shadows crawled across the walls, stretching into the corners where the concrete darkened with old stains he preferred not to look at too closely. Against the back wall stood the barrels. 5 of them, thick blue plastic, each marked for chemical use, each carrying the faint crust of lye and old work that had dried in white scales like mineral frost. He bought the barrels in Alabama with a fake name he barely remembered. Everyone could hold 55 gallons, but he never dared fill them more than 3/4. Add too much weight, too many pieces, and the mixture surged, overflowed. Once it dripped into the concrete, once was enough to teach him caution. He crossed to the workbench where everything began. This part was almost sacred to him. The routine, the method, the slow transformation from man into worker, from worker into something colder. He set out the protective apron made of thick rubber, pulled on gloves that swallowed his arms past the elbows, fitted goggles tight until the seal pressed into his skin. Only then did he place the tools on the oil-lined cloth, each in its designated spot, each waiting for the task they were built for. Outside, the forest kept singing, restless and uneasy. Inside, Ray prepared to make soap the way he always had, the way no one must ever discover. He arranged the tools in a careful line, moving from left to right the electric saw, the boning knife, the cleaver, and finally the thin fillet blade that had spent half its life against a sharpening stone. Each one gleamed under the weak light. He scrubbed them after every job, but habit made him lift them toward the bulb anyway, turning the metal to check for the tiniest fleck that might turn into rust. Precision mattered. Sloppiness ruined everything. That was the difference between him and Travis. Travis charged through life like a fire, wild, fast, and destructive. He acted on whatever emotion hit him first. No planning, no caution, no cleanup, just wreckage. Ray had spent 2 decades undoing the trail of violence Travis left behind. 20 years of perfecting a craft no manual dared describe. 20 years of learning exactly how lye behaved, how the mixture shifted when it was too cold or too hot, how bones held on long after flesh surrendered. Teeth were the worst, stubborn little stones that had to be pried out, crushed to dust, and scattered far apart so no one ever noticed. By the end, what remained of a person weighed less than a sack of flour, 5 pounds of minerals, salts, and brittle calcium. Nothing that would speak, nothing that the woods couldn't swallow. He set the blades down, removed his apron and gloves, and hung them neatly on their hooks. Not yet. Not until he was steady. A man didn't begin something like this with a clouded head or a trembling hand. You needed a stillness inside you, a purpose you didn't question. Ray crossed to the old metal footlocker in the corner. The hinges groaned softly as he opened it. Inside sat a bottle of whiskey with a line halfway down, and beside it, a photograph that had traveled through too many years. He picked up the picture and let the dusty bulb cast its sickly glow across the worn edges. 2 boys stood shoulder to shoulder in front of a lake. The younger one was beaming, arm clasped tightly around the older boy, who smiled too, but with a caution born from knowing happiness never stayed long. Behind them, the lake was still, dark enough to swallow secrets. The photo was 21 years old. Heat had curled the corners. Tiny cracks ran through the surface like fissures in old paint. It had lived in a wallet, then a back pocket, then this shed, aging the same way everything in this place did, slow and inevitable. Travis was 18 the day that picture was taken. Ray was 22. They'd spent the morning fishing, unaware of all the storms that would come after. They'd spent that afternoon sweating on the dock, lines in the water, joking about how not a single fish in Mississippi wanted to bite. The cooler between them held more beer than bait, and they emptied it just as the sun slipped behind the trees. Ray remembered the warmth of that last shared laughter, how it felt like the world was still simple, still salvageable. It was the final peaceful day they ever had. 2 weeks after that, Travis was booked into Parchment for the first time. Ray slid the photograph back into the footlocker and shut the lid. The shed fell silent again, heavy and breathless. He rubbed his arms absent-mindedly, the skin raw and angry from the chemical splashes he'd taken earlier. Tiny burns dotted his forearms like a constellation etched into flesh, some red and blistered, others scabbed, others faded into pale, ghost-like scars. 20 years had carved a map across his skin. Every burn was a life. Every scar was a memory. Every mark was Travis calling him for help. He had stopped counting long ago. The work had always been grim. But it had a purpose, or at least that's what Ray told himself. Tonight, though, something sat wrong in his chest, pressing down as though the air had thickened into syrup. He crossed the shed and checked the barrels again, each one steady and perfect. The plastic coverings were sealed tight. The mixture levels sat exactly where they needed to be. The pH strips bled the deepest possible red, pure 14, exactly on point. Everything in the room was prepared. Except him. He stood at the workbench, palms spread against the worn grain, feeling the grooves carved by years of repetition. He tried to still his mind, to summon the old, cold resolve that used to come so easily. But this time, his thoughts drifted to the phone call that had dragged him back here. Travis's voice had sounded wrong. Not wild, not furious. Just empty. I need you to come pick something up. Same spot. No excuses. No frantic breathing. No promise that this was the last mess Ray would have to erase. Travis had never been good with words, but Ray knew how to hear the things left unsaid, and there had been a void in that silence. a shift he couldn't name but felt deep in his bones. They had crossed into a place there was no coming back from. The killings had been spiraling for months, strangers who didn't deserve what happened to them. That boy at the liquor store, barely old enough to vote, cut down because he'd looked at Travis the wrong way. Ray had handled the aftermath, dissolving bone and flesh until nothing identifiable remained. But something inside him cracked that night. A noise he couldn't describe but felt, like a beam splitting somewhere deep in the structure of who he was. Then came the woman in the grocery store parking lot, middle-aged, holding paper bags and car keys. Travis said she reminded him of their mother. Ray hadn't asked why. Some truths were better left buried. He'd taken that body too, loaded it gently into the bed of his truck, pretending the world was still repairable. But standing now in the dim heat of the shed, he knew those last excuses had worn thin as the old fillet knife on the table beside him. He picked her up at midnight behind the warehouse, wrapped her carefully and driven her back here. When the work was done, he'd climbed into the bed of his truck and dry heaved until his stomach clenched and his ribs throbbed. That one had felt different, wrong in a way none of the others had. And people were talking. In the bars where Ray kept his head down and his ears open, conversations died the moment he walked in. Old men muttered into their drinks, and younger ones glanced around before lowering their voices. The Dixie boys had made up their minds. Travis had become a stray they couldn't afford to let run loose. A danger to the crew. A storm that hit whoever happened to be standing too close. Ray could have let them handle it. They were good at disappearing problems. Quick, clean, silent. They would have taken Travis out to some forgotten patch of woods, put 2 rounds in the back of his head, and the world would never hear his name again. But it was Travis they were planning to erase. 3 nights ago, at 2 in the morning, Ray had sat alone in his apartment, the room lit only by a street lamp bleeding through the blinds. He'd been drinking straight from the whiskey bottle, staring at the photograph of the 2 boys at the lake, trying to find something in their faces that explained what their lives had become. That was when he made his decision. If Travis had to go, if this was the end that had been crawling toward them for years, then Ray would be the one to do it. His hands, not theirs. His mercy, not their cruelty. He'd make it fast. He'd make sure Travis didn't see it coming. And afterward, he'd bring him here to this lonely patch of land and reduce him to the same quiet dust he'd given to all the others. Scatter what was left. Let the earth swallow the last trace. It was the final kindness he had left to give. He stepped out of the shed into the thick Mississippi night. The cicadas had reached a frenzy, their voices swelling in waves that trembled through the trees. The old oaks around the property rattled with their song. Out in the yard, the truck waited with its tailgate down. In the bed lay a blue tarp wrapped around a shape that couldn't be mistaken for anything but a man. Yellow nylon ropes cinched around it, the knots dark with stains that hadn't fully dried. Ray stood there, breathing in the swamp stink drifting from the south, that heavy blend of decay and overgrowth, life and rot wrestling in the same black water. Mosquitoes landed on his neck, his arms, his face. He didn't brush them away. A heron screamed somewhere far off, a sound too old and raw for the modern word. He had done this so many times that the count had stopped mattering. Years ago, the numbers had become something else, a ledger of Travis's chaos. Each job another frantic attempt to save him from the violence that lived inside him like a disease running through his blood. Travis had been that way since he was small, a spark that always seemed a breath away from becoming a wildfire. Where other boys hesitated, he lunged. Where others paused, he crossed lines without even noticing they existed. Their father had tried to beat caution into him, to hammer discipline where there was none, but some parts of a soul don't bend. Some just break. Their father had tried to beat that wildness out of Travis, and their mother had begged heaven to soften him, but nothing ever touched the part of him that burned. By 16, Travis had already carved his name into the wrong kind of record, locked up for smashing a man so brutally the poor soul never saw out of one eye again. And when the sentence was handed down, Travis didn't flinch, didn't apologize, didn't care. Ray cared. Ray always had. He visited every week, sat across from his brother through scratched glass, listened to every lie, every excuse, every promise Travis would never keep. And when the gates finally opened and Travis walked out, Ray was waiting. Because family wasn't something you abandoned. Not in their world. Not after everything they'd survived. You held on even when the rope cut into your hands. When the Dixie boys scooped Travis up, Ray had almost felt grateful. They gave Travis a role, a paycheck, a purpose for the violence he carried like a second heartbeat. For a while, it worked. Travis broke bones for men who needed bones broken, and Ray told himself this was better controlled destruction instead of senseless chaos. But then the killings changed. It wasn't jobs anymore. It wasn't orders. It was Travis picking targets like he was choosing snacks off a shelf. A teenager behind a counter who talked back. A mother carrying groceries who reminded him of someone. The scenes he left behind were no longer quick or quiet. They were grotesque, twisted, the work of someone who had started enjoying them. And the Dixie Mafia had a simple rule. Violence was fine as long as it was clean. As long as it was obedient. Travis had stopped being either. So Ray stepped into a different role, the one nobody wanted but somebody had to do. He read until the words blurred, tested mixtures behind the tree line until he understood exactly what dissolved and what didn't. He became the one who made Travis's chaos vanish, the man who washed the slate clean. But lately the stains were coming too fast. 3 bodies in 14 days. The whispers in the bars grew teeth. The men behind those whispers were circling, patient as wolves. A warning had already been spoken. Travis was becoming a risk. Risks were eliminated. Unless Ray eliminated him first. He reached into the bed of the truck and grabbed the tarp. The material had hardened where the blood had dried, and when he tugged, the shape beneath it shifted with that awful, unresisting heaviness only the dead had. He pulled until the form slid toward the edge, then let gravity take it. The thud echoed across the yard like a dull drumbeat. For a moment, Ray just stood there, chest rising and falling, sweat rolling down the center of his spine. The cicadas wailed overhead, shrill and relentless. He crouched, grabbed the rope cinched around the tarp and began dragging the body toward the shed. The ground fought him, roots snagged the plastic, stones tore at the seams, but he kept pulling, step after step. By the time he reached the doorway, his shirt clung to him, soaked through. The burns on his arms had opened again, clear fluid tracing down the raw skin like dew. Inside, beneath the single trembling bulb, he positioned the body. His hands worked at the knots, fingers shaking but sure. The rope loosened. The tarp began to fall away. And the truth of what he had done, and what he had yet to do, waited in the darkness beneath it. He forced his numb hands to grip the edge of the tarp and lift. For a heartbeat, he couldn't breathe. The face staring up from the truck bed didn't belong to his brother. He leaned closer, hoping his eyes were lying to him, but the truth stayed fixed and cold. A man he'd never seen before lay there, somewhere past middle age, with hair going thin and a mustache fatting to silver. Nothing remarkable about him, The kind of man who could disappear into a crowd without anyone noticing. But the wound across his throat, that was unforgettable. It wasn't sloppy or frantic. It was deliberate, clean. A single stroke delivered by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Someone who had trained for that kind of finality. Someone with skill Ray prayed he'd never see again. Someone like Travis. Ray's stomach turned as he stared down at the corpse. He had driven here to retrieve his brother's body, the grim task he had forced himself to accept over the last 3 days. He had prepared himself to carry out the mercy his brother begged for. But this was not his brother. He turned in place, scanning the dim shed as if it might whisper an answer. Everything was painfully familiar, the row of metal drums, the tools on the bench, the concrete floor with its old, dark stains. Nothing out of order, nothing disturbed, except the stranger lying where Travis should have been. Ray tried to rewind the day, to piece it back together in a straight line. It started with the call, Travis's voice, strained and urgent. "Come pick something up." The abandoned fuel stop off the highway, a place the two of them never used. Ray remembered the drive. He remembered the heat of the engine clicking as he parked, the rough texture of the steering wheel, stepping out into the gravel. But after that, everything blurred. He remembered circling the building. He remembered seeing the tarp already in the truck bed, the shape underneath it, the ropes tied tight. What he didn't remember was doing any of it. He didn't remember lifting the body. He didn't remember tying a single knot. He didn't remember covering the face. There had been a note on the windshield, though. That part was clear. He dug into his pocket now, pulled out the folded paper, and held it under the pale light. "Clean this up, I'll contact you." 4 simple words that made his knees weaken. But the handwriting, that's what stopped his breath. Travis never wrote neatly. His letters were jagged, impatient, words crammed together like they were fighting to get out. He wrote the way he talked, rough, rushed, unpolished. This writing was the opposite. Smooth curves, even spacing, control. Every letter shaped with the calm certainty of someone who'd been doing this their whole life. Someone who was Travis. Ray lowered the note with trembling hands, a cold realization settling over him. Someone else had used his brother's voice. Someone else had staged this scene. And wherever Travis was, he wasn't the one calling for help. Ray stared at the note like it was written in a language he'd never seen before. It took almost a full minute for the truth to break through. The handwriting was his, not Travis's, not a stranger's. His own careful, practiced script, the kind he only used for things that mattered. He felt the realization hit him like a blow to the chest. The paper drifted from his fingers and landed on the concrete with a soft whisper. Something inside him twisted, a quiet tearing, as if a hidden seam in his mind had finally given way. He tried to chase the meaning, tried to grab hold of the thought forming in the back of his skull, but every time he reached for it, it slipped aside. Like his brain was shielding him from something he wasn't ready to see. He forced himself back to the body, the one he didn't remember killing. The man wore clothes that spoke of long days and simple routines, faded jeans, a checkered flannel, boots that had seen years of work. A wedding ring clung to his left hand, the gold so worn it had become thin and smooth. A life lived day after day without glamour or glory. Ray's hands moved on their own, searching pockets with a method he'd learned long ago. Left pocket empty, Right pocket loose coins. Back pockets a wallet stiff from use. He opened it. His fingers felt wooden, like they belonged to someone else. A driver's license. A name, Dennis Waynow. Born in '78. Lived on Maple Street. A face frozen in an awkward half-smile. The kind people put on when the camera flashes before they're truly ready. Inside the wallet were a few folded bills, a receipt from a grocery run 2 days earlier, a card from a plumbing company, and behind the cash, a small photograph. 2 kids stood before a Christmas tree, a boy missing his front teeth, a girl in bright glasses and a sweater with a cartoon reindeer. Their arms were around each other, smiling like only children can. A woman's legs were just visible behind them, someone waiting patiently for them to finish. Ray stared until his eyes burned. This man had bought groceries. This man had kissed his kids goodnight. This man had lived nearly 5 decades. And now he lay on Ray's shed floor, his life cut open, and Ray couldn't remember the moment it happened. He lowered the wallet to the ground with trembling hands. His fingers wouldn't stop shaking. When he looked down at them, he saw what he'd missed earlier. Dark stains under his nails. Thin crescents of dried blood. He must have washed his hands, probably more than once, but not well enough to hide the truth from the small shadows beneath his fingertips. He turned toward the workbench in a daze. The knife he used for everything, cutting rope, trimming hide, breaking down what needed to disappear, gleamed under the single light. When he picked it up, the handle felt tacky. He raised it closer. There, in the slender gap where the blade met the handle, was a thread of darkness. Blood that had dripped, run down the steel, and settled into the seam where water couldn't reach. He had cleaned this blade. He had scrubbed it. But he had not erased what he had done. Ray could still see it, the knife under the running water, the handle cold in his grip, the stream turning dark and swirling away. He remembered the motions clearly, but the memory itself felt thin, like it didn't belong to him, like he was watching some other man's hand through a sheet of glass. He set the knife down with care and turned toward the old footlocker in the corner. The latch clicked open beneath his fingers, revealing clothes folded with an unsettling neatness. His clothes, a spare set he kept here, though he couldn't remember why, couldn't remember the day he brought them, couldn't remember the reason he thought he might need them. He lifted the shirt from the top of the pile, a gray work shirt, tough fabric, worn soft by years of heat and sweat. Across the front were tiny, scattered dots. A familiar pattern, one he recognized instantly. Arterial spray. The kind that misted the air when a throat opened under a beating heart. A perfect constellation of crimson droplets, exactly where they'd be if he had been standing close, too close, to the man on his shed floor. But he wasn't wearing this shirt. Not tonight. He looked down at himself, a clean denim shirt. Or almost clean. When he pushed up his left sleeve, he saw it, a nearly invisible smear of dried blood at the cuff. A casual swipe from a bloody hand. The kind of thing you did in the middle of a job without realizing you'd done it. His breath stuttered. He dropped the gray shirt, dug deeper, lifted a pair of jeans. The stains on them were unmistakable. A dark patch hardened on the right knee. The kind you got when you knelt beside a dying man, staying there until the pulse faded and the breath thinned, waiting to be certain the life was gone. Under the clothes lay something small and black. A digital recorder. The sight of it tugged at something in him, a memory he couldn't reach but could feel. He picked it up. It rested in his palm like it belonged there. Inside was a tape. His thumb found the play button. A hiss of static crackled from the tiny speaker, and then his own voice. "Ray, listen to me. You need to hear this." He froze. That was him. His tone, his cadence. But he had no memory of speaking those words. No recollection of ever owning a recorder. His pulse thudded in his ears. He hit play again. "You're going to wake up soon, and when you do, you won't remember. You never remember." A pause, breathing, his breathing. "So I'm telling you now, while you're still clear." Another long, trembling inhale from the recording. "There is no Travis. There hasn't been for 20 years. Ray's spine went rigid. The voice on the tape continued, steady and sorrowful. "Travis died out there in the swamp. You saw it. You saw what pulled him under. You watched the water close. You've been talking to a ghost you built yourself from the guilt you never buried." Ray's knees nearly buckled. The recorder kept whispering truths he wasn't ready for. You invented him to survive what you couldn't face. But every time you forget, you start over. And every time you start over, men die. Ray stared at the recorder, unable to breathe, unable to blink. The voice, his voice pressed on. "This man in your shed, he isn't the first, and he won't be the last unless you finally hear me." The tape clicked softly as the message ended. Ray stood there in the dim light, the recorder trembling in his hands, the shed closing in around him. And for the first time in 20 years, he understood what he had become. The recorder crackled again, a thin hiss filling the shed. "You know this," the voice said. "You've always known deep down." Ray froze. Something moved in the background, faint, relentless, the cicadas outside. The sound was eerily familiar. The recording had been made here in this very shed. "But you can't accept it," the voice continued. "When he died, your mind fractured. It built something to protect you. It built Travis, a version of him still alive, still reckless, still needing you." His legs gave out. Ray sank to the concrete, the recorder clutched in his trembling hands. When you couldn't save him, when the guilt became too heavy, you began creating moments where you could. Hours, sometimes days, you slip into fugue states. And in those moments you become him. The violence, the killings, all of it. Then you wake up, and there's a body. Your mind tells you Travis did it. Travis called you. Travis needs you to fix it. And you believe it because you have to. "No, no, no," the voice rasped, shaking with its own urgency. "I'm recording this during a clear moment. I don't know how long it will last. You need to hear the truth." A pause, static, then the confession. "We killed this man, Dennis Hoy. Random, gas station this morning, followed him to work, waited, executed, simple as that." The tape cut off abruptly. Silence descended like a fog in the shed. Ray sat there numb. The recorder felt like a brick in his palm. He wanted to throw it, smash it, obliterate it, destroy the evidence of what? The truth. He looked down at the body, Dennis Hoy. A man with a wedding ring, children, a life, ended because of something inside Ray he had never been able to control. There was no Travis. The realization pressed down on him, heavy as the concrete beneath him, undeniable and cold. Not revelation, not sudden shock, but a truth he had carried all along, buried behind a wall of denial that had held firm for 20 years. And now the wall was crumbling. Behind it, the memory surfaced, raw and unstoppable. Travis had died in the swamp. Ray had been 23, Travis 19. They had been running shine for a man named Bodie Pierce, a small operation, barely enough to pay for beer. The boat was a flat-bottomed skiff with a sputtering outboard, mason jars stacked high, the black water silent, waiting. Travis had been laughing about some girl, some joke. Ray hadn't noticed the tilt. The boat rocked just enough. Travis slipped, overboard. The water swallowed him, still laughing at first, then screaming as the swamp claimed him. Before Ray could reach him, the gator struck, and just like that, Travis was gone. Gone, leaving behind a hole in Ray's mind that he had spent 20 years filling with shadows, voices, and imagined rescues. And now the truth was here, undeniable, staring him in the face. The river had swallowed him in a single violent moment. 1 second he was fighting to stay above the churning water. The next, the surface went flat, as if the world had already decided he was gone. 3 days later, what remained of Travis was discovered tangled in the twisted roots of an old cypress far downstream. Rye was the one who stood in that cold little room, staring at the ruined shape that once carried his brother's laughter. His voice barely worked when they asked for confirmation, but he forced the words out anyway. He went home afterward with a silence inside him that felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. He pressed a gun to his teeth, pulled the trigger, and only heard a hollow click. In his grief, he hadn't even loaded it. The failure broke him open. He slid to the floor and cried until his body simply couldn't anymore. And then morning came. With the sunrise came a voice, Travis's voice. Not a memory, not a dream, a presence. It whispered to him, phoned him, left messages that only Rye ever seemed to find. It begged for help, pleaded for protection, demanded vengeance. And Rye, drowning in guilt he couldn't name, obeyed. He built an entire second world inside his mind, a place where Travis still lived, where Travis was dangerous, where Travis needed him. In that world, Rye wasn't broken. He had a purpose. He became the shield, the fixer, the one who cleaned up the chaos his brother supposedly unleashed. What he never realized was that it was Travis doing the killing. It was him. Each time someone died, Rye's mind split like a curtain. One half carried out the violence, cold, efficient, detached, while the other half stood helplessly apart, convinced he was only witnessing someone else's crimes. And when he came back to himself, when he saw the blood and the body and the ruin, his mind built the same lie again. Travis did this. Travis needs me to cover it up. And so he did. Every time. He used real chemicals, real tools, real knowledge. Bodies turned to sludge, then to nothing. And all the while the truth stayed buried. There was no brother to save, not anymore. Sometimes he tried to count them. All the men who disappeared. All the families left with photographs no one would ever grow old in. But the numbers slipped through him. 2 decades of memories lay shattered in his head like shards of a broken mirror. And whenever he tried to piece them together, they only cut him deeper. He looked at the man lying at his feet in that shed, a fresh body, still warm. He tried to picture the moment he struck, the instant the blade slid across skin. But that memory was sealed away behind a door he didn't know how to open. What he did remember was afterward. Standing under a flickering streetlight, hand trembling, the knife slick and glistening. A strange calm inside him, a terrible sense of purpose. Then the shift, the fog rolling in, the other version of him stepping forward while the rest of him fell back. The protector, the cleaner, the Rye who loved his brother so fiercely, he created a ghost to keep him alive. Something rustled in the far corner of the shed. Rye lifted his head slowly. There was nothing there, only the thick dark and the shapes it made. But he felt it. That familiar breath on the back of his neck. That voice rising again from the place he never dared to look. Rye, I'm still here. A shadow pressed into the corner of the shed, a shape that whispered of the boy he had lost. Travis, 19, hair matted with swamp water, mouth frozen in a scream that never reached silence. And then the cicadas stopped, every last one. The world seemed to pause, the stillness pressing against him like a living weight. In that sudden void, he could hear everything. His ragged breath, the faint drip from a corner drum, the pulse of blood in his veins. His legs wobbled as he rose. Every motion felt foreign, heavy, as if gravity itself had thickened. He reached for the boning knife on the workbench. Smooth in his hand, shaped over countless uses, a familiar extension of himself. How many times had it tasted life? How many throats had it parted? He turned to the body on the floor. Dennis Hoy, a father, a husband, a man who had walked out of his home that morning unaware of the finality awaiting him. And it was Ray, not some phantom brother, who had stolen that life. The weight of the knife was intimate enough to finish the cycle himself. He imagined letting it pierce his own skin, letting the chemistry take him too. No trace, no explanation, just another disappearance swallowed by the world. But he didn't. His mind, fractured though it was, clung to survival. The same mind that had created Travis would not allow its own destruction. He set the blade down. The work remained. Dennis Hoy still had to vanish. The reasons no longer mattered, only the result. No body, no trail, no questions. He moved toward the drums, but his body refused him. Hands dropped uselessly to his sides. The tape recorder sat where he had thrown it, his own voice echoing in the hollow of his skull. There is no Travis. 20 years of bodies, 20 years of chemistry, 20 years protecting a ghost. And then the smell hit him. Wrong. Not the usual sharp bite of sodium hydroxide. Something rotten, alive in its decay, crawling beneath the chemical veneer. He turned to the drums. The first one seemed ordinary. Lid sealed, barrel level, the concrete beneath untainted. The second drum was off. The lid skewed almost imperceptibly. At its base spread a thick gray-brown puddle. He stepped closer. The stench became overwhelming, chemical tang mixed with something ancient, organic, dead before its time, something that should not exist here. He inhaled again, heart hammering. Something had gone wrong, and for the first time in 20 years, the rules he had known, the certainty of his world, the rhythm of the work, had betrayed him. The stench hit him first, thick, sour, and unmistakably alive in its decay. His fingers trembled as he pried open the lid of the nearest barrel. The moment it lifted, a wall of rot rolled out and punched the breath from his lungs. Inside, the liquid was no longer the clear, hungry solution he'd trusted for years. It had turned murky, almost gelatinous. A pale, wax-like film floated on top, trembling with the movement of the drum. And beneath that layer, shapes, human shapes. A curled hand drifting like a dead leaf. A ribcage still clinging to cartilage. A piece of skull, hair slicked against it, bobbing gently as if trying to rise for air. His knees nearly buckled. The process had failed completely. Whether it was a mistake in the mixture, a moment of distraction, or the collapse of the mind that once guided him with cold precision, he couldn't tell. But the truth was undeniable. The bodies were coming back. He stumbled to the second drum. That lid barely resisted. Pressure from inside had already pushed it loose. When he looked down, the sight mirrored the first, unfinished dissolution, unmistakable remains, the past clawing its way to the surface. Third drum, fourth, fifth, all of them ruined, every last one. The barrels he had trusted like silent partners had reached their limit. Too many victims, too much weight, too many years of work poured into them until they could no longer swallow what he fed them. How long had they been like this? How many nights had he walked away thinking he'd erased someone forever, while the truth was quietly accumulating in the dark? He stood frozen in the middle of the shed, surrounded by the ghosts he had tried to hide, and something in him cracked, quietly, finally, and beyond repair. For 2 decades, the lie had given him direction. Believing he was shielding his brother had been the only thing keeping him upright. But the method, the science, the brutal precision that had been real, that was the part of him that felt sharp, capable, almost human. And now even that had collapsed. Not even his work obeyed him anymore. He stepped outside, the door groaning behind him like the shed itself was grieving. The yard stretched out in washed-out gray as the first hints of morning touched the horizon. Dawn was coming, slow and cold. The cicadas shrieked from the trees, wild, relentless, as if trying to tear the sky open with their voices. His truck sat waiting in the dirt, tailgate lowered. His tools lay abandoned in the shed, and tucked away in a footlocker, a faded photograph of 2 boys at a lakeside, one smiling, one squinting against the sun. All those years, that picture had been a compass. Now it felt like a forgotten prop from a story that had ended long ago. Ever since the water swallowed Travis, everything after had been nothing more than a long, haunted afterword. He pulled out his phone. The screen was cracked spiderweb, but it still lit up. And with a slow, steady breath, he dialed. He punched in the emergency number with hands that felt strangely distant, as if they belonged to someone else. When the call connected, his voice was flat, emptied of everything but the facts. He gave the address. He told them what waited inside the shed. He told them they'd need more people than they thought. Then he ended the call. He stepped out into the yard and lowered himself to the ground beside the truck, the dirt cold against his back. The cicadas shrilled through the trees, a relentless chorus. Maybe they had been calling out like this for decades, and only now, at the end, did he finally hear them. He studied his hands. Cracked skin, chemical scars, blood smeared beneath the nails. These were the hands that had carved, soaked, scrubbed, dissolved. And for the first time, he couldn't pretend they belonged to someone else. They were his. All of it was his. Far off, sirens began threading through the morning air, thin at first, then swelling, coming closer. Soon they'd reach the dirt road. Soon they'd see everything he had hidden. For a moment, a single moment, he imagined jumping into the truck and flooring it, just disappearing, leaving behind the shed, the drums, the decades of silence. But the thought flickered out almost as quickly as it came. He didn't have the strength for running anymore. 20 years of guilt had finally grown too heavy, too real. There was nowhere left to go. So he stayed. He watched the sky brighten. He listened to the rasping song of the insects, thick and endless. Behind him, the shed stood still, sheltering the barrels that continued their slow, merciless work. Even without him, the reaction inside them would keep unfolding, breaking down what was left, stripping away the pieces of lives he had ended. The chemicals didn't care about grief or madness. They didn't care about a broken man trying to save a brother who was long gone. They followed their rules. Add the mixture, add the body, wait. And eventually, nothing remained. The sirens grew louder, flashing lights cutting through the trees like shards of red and blue dawn. He closed his eyes. He listened to the cicada scream for the life he had ruined, and he prepared himself for what came next. When the officers questioned him, he would tell them everything. The drowning, the swamp, the guilt that had cracked his mind open, the voice that wasn't real, the murders committed by hands he pretended weren't his own. They wouldn't believe any of it, he knew that. They would think it was a performance, a desperate attempt to dodge punishment. But this was the truth. A truth uglier than any excuse. A truth he could no longer outrun. He had invented a ghost to hide from the fact that the real monster had always been him. He had been killing to protect a shadow, the terrible truth. That shadow was himself. Suddenly, lights pierced the darkness. Patrol cars roared into the yard, doors flung open. Officers surged out, guns trained, voices shouting commands he obeyed without hesitation. The dirt pressed warm against his cheek, the metal cuffs biting into burned flesh on his wrists. They yanked him upright, shoved him toward the waiting car, and a voice droned his rights. He nodded. He understood the words, but their meaning was gone. Through the tinted window, he watched the swarm. Investigators and forensic teams moved through the yard with cold precision, instruments clicking, cameras snapping. One of them stumbled upon the shed. The door swung open. He caught a glimpse of their recoil, the shudder that made one of them vomit into the dirt. He looked away. He didn't need to see the horrors inside, the drums, the contents, the history of his life measured in chemical decay. That shed had become the axis of his existence. The car rolled forward. He could see the shed shrink into a shadow against the trees until it vanished. But the sound lingered, the relentless cicadas of a Mississippi summer, the echo of his brother's last scream, the fracture of his own mind. That sound had been waiting 20 years for him to finally hear it. Story 2, The Route You Don't Take. Night driving changes you. People stop being people. They become data points, small ratings on a screen, a voice giving you coordinates and a time. You learn quickly not to stare at the nervous hands, the trembling knuckles, the luggage stacked just so in the back seat. You don't ask why someone needs a lift from nowhere at 2:00 a.m. I've been running these rides for 7 months. 7 months of endless darkness, long enough that alerts no longer startled me awake. I was always awake, moving through the hours that slipped between yesterday's chaos and tomorrow's uncertainty. I could calculate bills, debts, grocery money, all while steering by muscle memory, bathed in the cold, blue glow of the app. The request pinged at 2:03 a.m. I was parked at a truck stop outside Millbrook, chewing on cheap sushi because eating real food had become a liability. My thumb hesitated over the screen. Pickup, a private road 16 miles into real nowhere. No GPS label, just coordinates. The map preview was a straight shot down I-90, miles I needed. Every mile counted. I hit accept. The road swallowed me whole. Darkness so thick it felt liquid pressing in from all sides. My headlights carved a narrow tunnel through pine trees whose branches scraped my roof like fingernails. No cars, no houses, just the dim glow of the GPS and my own pale reflection, floating across the windshield like a ghost. I knew these back roads, shortcuts and forgotten highways known only to those who worked nights. But this was different. This road didn't exist on normal maps. It lived in the gaps, the spaces between real towns, traced only on old survey charts, relics of a century-long abandonment. Signal dropped, one bar, then nothing. The asphalt gave way to gravel, the gravel to dirt, potholes jarring my suspension. I thought of the overdue inspection, the failing brakes, the slow mechanical decay I couldn't afford to repair. The car, like everything else in my life, was breaking down piece by piece. I should have turned back, should have canceled, taken the ratings hit, gone back to the fluorescent hum of the truck stop. But 300 meters on the map meant groceries, electricity, rent for another week, the class trip my daughter had dreamed about. I kept driving. The forest thinned abruptly, opening onto a clearing that was unnaturally flat. Stumps, disturbed earth. The land had been pushed back deliberately. A house had once stood here. Foundations half buried, stone steps leading to nothing. A lone chimney rising like a tombstone from the undergrowth. And there he was, standing in the cone of my headlights like an actor taking his cue, poised and still. First thought, stage. Overcoat expensive, cut with precision, the kind of clothing that whispered money and intention. He didn't move. He waited, and the hair on the back of my neck prickled. Something about him, about this road, this hour, screamed wrong. I took a deep breath, gripping the wheel. One foot on the brake, one on the accelerator. Every instinct told me to stop, turn around, drive back to the safety of streetlights and traffic. But the promise of survival, of keeping my life barely together, kept me moving forward, into the unknown. He was dressed like privilege itself, dark slacks with a crisp crease, polished shoes that could have bought my car twice. But his face was broken. Pale, wide-eyed, jaw slack. Like he'd seen the end of the world and somehow survived. I double-checked the app, heart thumping. Yes, this was my ride. He climbed into the back without a word, bringing with him the faint, cloying scent of cologne that tried, and failed, to mask something sharper underneath. Copper, sweat, fear. My voice stayed neutral, professional. The tone I used for every desperate or drunk soul who'd climbed into my car at 3 a.m. I asked him where he was headed. He didn't answer, just fumbled for his phone, checked something quickly, then stashed it away. His hands trembled, low-light shadows dancing over his knuckles. Something dark smudged the cuff of his sleeve. A wet sheen, coppery. The metallic tang hit me before I even processed the sight. Blood. Then he spoke, offered cash. $10,000 right now. No stops, no questions. 3 months of rent. The debts clawing at my chest. My daughter's school fees. Everything I'd been stretching myself thin to pay, wrapped into one desperate plea. My hands froze on the wheel. I tried to negotiate digital protocol, the rules. No cash rides, never go off app, always a record. But he shook his head violently. No app, he said. Cash, now. He counted it out, trembling hundreds stacked like fragile promises across the console. I'd read the warnings, drivers disappearing, lives ruined. Algorithms weren't just tools, they were shields. Yet here it all was, paper and sweat and fear. I looked at the money. I looked at him. Eyes darting to the shadows outside like the dark held something ready to pounce. He repeated Ohio, 3 states away, and then almost inaudibly he said, please. The single word sliced through everything. Vulnerability, humanity, desperation. In that instant, he stopped being just another rating, another task on my nightly grind. He became someone needing help, the way I sometimes did, the way all of us did in our quiet moments of terror and exhaustion. I told him to buckle up, didn't touch the cash, didn't count it, just shifted into reverse and crawled toward the main road, headlights cutting a path through the endless black. His breathing was loud in the back, ragged, unsure. The money sat between us like evidence of a world I wasn't ready to understand. When we reached I-90, I turned east. Every mile ahead felt like a negotiation with fate itself, a slow, deliberate step into a night that might never end. I drove on, leaving behind the warmth of my apartment, my daughter's laughter, the fragile normalcy of my life, steering straight into the unknown. He didn't speak. Not once. For the first hour, he sat in the back like a statue, stiff, motionless, eyes fixed on the darkness outside. I kept the radio off. Words felt dangerous, questions even more so. Silence, I decided, was safer. But silence has a way of magnifying everything. Every little sound became a jolt. The quiet click of the engine cooling after each stop, the subtle rasp of his breath, the soft rustle of fabric as he shifted just enough to remind me he was alive. 40 minutes in, a small noise escaped him, a throat clearing, barely audible, like someone straining not to break. My eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. He leaned toward the window, and yet his reflection met mine. Wide eyes frozen, as if watching a scene only he could see. Truck stops rushed past like fleeting memories, flares of harsh fluorescent light in the endless black. A flying J at mile marker 127, a pilot at 156, a Loves at 189, escape points, places with cameras, witnesses, humanity. I didn't slow down, didn't glance at the exits. My foot stayed steady, 67 mph, just over the limit, fast enough to make progress, slow enough to stay invisible. The cash rested on the console between us, crisp bills stacked in careless authority. Hundreds and thousands, tangible and impossible to ignore. I'd placed it there deliberately, a silent contract neither of us had agreed to, yet both were bound by. Around 3:15 a.m., he reached for his phone again. The movement was hesitant, like touching something scalding. The screen illuminated his pale, haunted face, and in that light I saw the fracture, something within him giving way, hope or delusion crumbling into stark awareness. He set it down, palms pressed to his thighs, shoulders rising and falling in careful, calculated rhythm, the breathing of someone clinging to control when every part of them feels underwater. I knew that breath. I'd practiced it myself, countless nights, in hospital waiting rooms, in offices stacked with bills, in hours when the world felt too heavy, when survival became a mechanical act. By 3:30, I needed gas. Tank dipping low, 40 miles to the next stop. The lights of a love station spilled like a lighthouse into the darkness, its endless fluorescent glare illuminating the scent of diesel and despair. I signaled my intention to refuel, simple, factual. His head snapped toward me, eyes suddenly sharp, alert, every muscle in his body coiled like a spring. In that moment, the quiet tension stretched between us, a taut wire strung over the void. We were bound together by fear, desperation, and the unspoken acknowledgement that neither of us could turn back. And somewhere deep in the dark, the road ahead promised that nothing, neither money nor control nor caution, would keep us safe from what was coming next. I caught his reflection in the rearview mirror, a single sharp shake of the head, a wordless refusal. I explained the logistics, the distance, the fuel, the necessity of caution. He asked for a figure. I gave a rough estimate. Without a word, he pressed more bills against the plexiglass barrier, cold paper against cold glass, and instructed me to pay at the pump and stay with the car. Hands trembling, I accepted the cash and stepped out. The night air hit like a shockwave, cutting through the heat that had built up in the car. As I fed the bills into the pump, my eyes never left him. He was on his phone again, thumbs moving like they had a life of their own. Then he froze. The device rested face down in his lap, deliberate and heavy, and my stomach twisted. My body already knew what my mind was only just realizing. Something about this was wrong. The pump clicked off. My hands worked automatically, replacing the nozzle, as the truth pressed down on me like the weight of the dark trees that hemmed in the lot. I walked past the driver's door toward the convenience store, fluorescent lights stabbing my eyes. A bored teen scrolling behind the register, the faint hum of refrigeration in the aisles. I made my way to the restrooms at the back, past shelves of candy, motor oil, and things nobody needed at 3:30 a.m. Inside, the institutional smell of disinfectant clung to every surface, harsher than any actual dirt. The lights flickered with every movement, casting my reflection in the mirror. Gray skin, hollow-eyed, someone unrecognizable staring back at me. A face carved by sleepless nights and miles behind the wheel. I pulled out my phone, signal weak, crawling progress bar. My thumb hovered, part of me wanting to stop before the truth could fully form. But it didn't matter. The headline erupted across the screen. Family of 4 found dead in Berkshire estate. Prominent businessman questioned. My hands started to shake. The article showed images. The house first. A grand colonial, white columns, black shutters, the kind of home that whispered wealth, tradition, untouchable privilege. Then the family portrait, him, my passenger, transformed into someone I didn't recognize. Arms around a woman with honey blonde hair, laugh lines etched with warmth. Arms around 2 children, 1 boy, 1 girl, in crisp white shirts and khakis, perched on a stone wall against autumn trees. Every detail staged perfect, every smile rehearsed. The kind of photo you paid for, displayed in frames, sent out with seasonal cards. I scrolled, stomach tightening with each new image, heart pounding in rhythm with a truth I wasn't ready to face, but couldn't ignore. The bodies had been found just hours before, discovered by the housekeeper as the sun dipped low, 6:00 p.m. sharp. Every news outlet was careful with its words, but the meaning was clear. Words like violent, domestic person of interest flashed across the screen. And then there it was, printed in bold, undeniable. Garrett Havlin, 47. Banker, philanthropist, pillar of society, and the same face staring at me from my rearview mirror. The same overcoat, sharp, tailored, whispering money and control. An update blinked across the page, time-stamped only 20 minutes ago. Police had issued a warrant. He was armed, dangerous. Anyone with knowledge of his location should call immediately. The motion sensor light above me clicked off, plunging the bathroom into darkness. I gripped my phone like a lifeline, the screen's cold blue glow casting ghostly reflections on the tile, the mirror, my own wide-eyed face. I could hear it all, the rush of my blood, the faint hum of the ventilation, the soft whir of the coolers out in the store, and the absence of any sound from my car just beyond the glass. I pulled the photo closer. The children. The boy had his father's square jaw, the girl her mother's soft smile. Their eyes held the unguarded innocence of youth, the kind that had never known fear, or had it. No, I corrected myself, past tense. They had been alive in the picture, but dead now. And sitting in my car behind me was the man who had taken them, with cash between us and hundreds of miles still to go. The light flickered on again, and I saw myself mirrored in the glass, same gray, hollow face. But now I recognized it. These were the eyes of someone who had witnessed blood, smelled fear, and yet driven on anyway. Accomplice eyes. When I stepped back out, he was already tracking me, body coiled, every movement shadowing mine. I slid into the driver's seat, heart hammering, started the engine, and merged onto the highway. What else could I do? Call the police and tell them what? That I had knowingly carried a killer, that I had seen the crimson stain on his cuff and still taken his money. The horizon was lightening now, that false dawn just before the real morning. In a few hours, my daughter would stir, wondering where I was. My phone would ring, my ex asking the same. Life would keep spinning while I kept driving east, carrying a murderer in my back seat. Then he spoke, calm but commanding. There's a service area in 20 miles. Pull in there. My throat tightened dry as ash. "Why?" I asked. He didn't answer immediately, just motioned to the road ahead, a single, deliberate gesture that left no room for argument. I knew enough to obey. Somewhere ahead there would be a phone call, a plan, another step in a journey I had no part of choosing, but now had no choice but to follow. The first rays of light were stretching across the horizon, painting the asphalt in a pale gold, when I realized exactly how close we were to the edge. He leaned forward, eyes catching mine in the rearview mirror, the morning illuminating every detail of his face. The tight jaw, the pale skin, the unmistakable flicker of something dangerous behind his eyes. He didn't ask if I'd seen the news. He knew I had. I didn't respond. I kept my gaze fixed on the road, on the white lines marching toward us like an endless countdown, anything but the reflection staring back at me. His voice broke the silence, calm, precise, measured. He understood how it looked, how terrifying this must have been. And yet he needed one more hour, one more stretch of road, one more stretch of control before I could even begin to comprehend. "I need you to drive me just a little further," he said. No begging, no panic, just the faintest edge of insistence. "Please." That single word hung between us, fragile but commanding, like it could somehow make all of this normal, make it manageable. I swallowed, tried to imagine another option, and found there was none. I drove. The service area appeared, a sanctuary of light and steel rising out of the early morning haze. Gas pumps gleamed under fluorescent bulbs, fast food signs blinked, and trucks were parked in neat rows, their drivers stealing rest between endless stretches of highway. I eased into a spot far from any other car, hands glued to the wheel, heart hammering like a drum. He stepped out, tall and deliberate, every movement a study in control. For a moment he just stood by the door, eyes scanning the building, as if reading a script only he understood. Then he moved forward, each step deliberate, measured, like a man walking toward the inevitable. Automatic doors swallowed him, and I realized I couldn't breathe. I reached for my phone, dialing 911. My lips parted, the words hanging in my throat. "There's a murderer. I have a murderer in my car. Please help me." But only my location came out. Service area, I-90, mile marker 247. The words were a shadow of the truth, an incomplete signal sent into the void. Then the passenger door opened. He slid in beside me, calm as if nothing had changed, and I saw the gun, resting in his lap, not aimed, just there. The weight of it pressed down without a single movement. My blood ran cold. "Hang up," he said softly, authority in every syllable. His gaze didn't leave mine. The operator's questions buzzed faintly in the background. I obeyed, letting the call die in my hand. We sat there, parked in a world that seemed oblivious to the danger inches away. Truckers shuffled past, coffee in hand. A family climbed back into their van, children laughing, unaware that a shadow had slipped into their morning. The gun in his lap was worse than a threat pointed at me. It was certainty, confidence, control. He didn't need to raise it. The presence alone said it all. It was polished, deliberate, the kind of weapon owned by someone who had practiced, trained, and waited for this moment. The air smelled of diesel and frying oil, ordinary and mundane, masking the extraordinary horror that had landed squarely in my life. And I realized sitting there that nothing would ever feel safe again. Not the road, not the light. Not even the quiet hum of the world going on around us. All of it was fragile, temporary, and in that small parking lot, I understood how close the edge really was. The morning air smelled faintly of exhaust and someone's cigarette smoke, drifting through the cracked windows. Outside, the world was waking up. car doors slamming, engines roaring to life, the distant beep of a truck revering. Life going on as usual while mine had been suspended in a tight coil of fear. I found myself cataloging every detail, the way I'd read people are supposed to if they survive something like this. The gun in his lap was unmistakably a Glock, or at least it looked real enough to make my pulse spike. His grip was steady now, nothing like the trembling from earlier. He had shed the expensive overcoat sometime along the way, revealing a simple dark sweater, merino wool, unwrinkled and deliberate. His shoes were immaculate, not a trace of the dirt and gravel we'd kicked up hours ago. Every part of him radiated control, precision, and planning, nothing left to chance. Then he spoke, and the desperate edge I'd heard in the backseat was gone. His tone was crisp, professional. "Detective Raymond Cutler," he said, "Philadelphia Police Department. I've been working undercover for 6 months to track the highway strangler." I turned fully toward him, eyes narrowing as he pulled a badge, gold and polished, holding it for me to see but not touch. "Philadelphia Police Department. Detective Raymond J. Cutler. Badge number 4782. My mind tried to register it, but I couldn't be sure. Real badges, fake badges. I'd never been arrested, never had more than a speeding ticket. My knowledge of law enforcement was shallow, pieced together from TV dramas and news stories. For all I knew, convincing fakes were sold online for $50. He started explaining, and I listened despite myself, despite the lingering terror. Everything about him sounded rehearsed, something he had said countless times before. The highway strangler targeted this route, he said, I-90, stretching between New York and Ohio. 3 victims in the last 8 months, all rideshare drivers, men between 30 and 50, all found in their vehicles with their throats cut. Each body discovered hours later by other drivers noticing the stillness, the unnerving absence. "The pattern is precise," he said. "Victims selected carefully, drivers with financial troubles, irregular schedules, men who work alone, men whose absence won't be noticed immediately, men like you." I opened my mouth to protest, to call this insane, but he went on. He described the setup, the fabricated news stories, real looking but planted online, the staged blood on his sleeves. He held up his cuff, and up close it did look off too bright, the texture wrong. Every article of clothing, he explained, chosen with purpose. Everything about him was a part of a story designed to manipulate, to survive scrutiny, to survive the highway. I sat frozen, the weight of it pressing down on me. The calm precision of his act, the eerie familiarity with fear, made me realize something terrifying. Whether or not he was truly a detective, everything in that moment was real enough to hold me in place, powerless, staring at the man who had orchestrated months of terror on the road. The whole thing, he said, had been engineered, every detail crafted to press the right psychological buttons. A regular driver, according to him, would have followed company protocol from the moment he stepped into the car. They would have insisted on logging the ride officially, refused off-the-books cash, kept the digital trail alive, and called the police the second something felt off. But I hadn't. Not right away. Instead, I'd seen what looked like blood and still pocketed $10,000. I'd driven him across empty stretches of highway. I'd walked into a gas station alone, leaving him with every opportunity to run or do something far worse. "That's not how most people react," he said, his voice low and analytical. "That's how opportunists react, or predators, or someone who's learned to hide in the cracks of desperation." He told me he'd picked my car on purpose, chosen me days ago, maybe weeks. He'd been watching my routes, how I always worked the graveyard shift, always accepted the longest fares, always said yes when the app suggested a risky pickup. He listed my debts as if reading from a file, credit cards maxed out, rent behind, school expenses piling up, complications with family. Exactly the profile the killer hunts, he said. Then, with a tilt of his head, or exactly the profile a killer might have. The words sat between us like something toxic, sinking into me slowly. I wasn't a person anymore. I was data, a pattern, a statistic that fit two possible boxes, victim or murderer. The absurdity of it nearly made me laugh. The cruelty of it almost made me snap. But all that came was exhaustion, heavy, bone-deep exhaustion. Then he asked the question, the one he'd been circling since he got into my car. "Tell me the truth," he said quietly. "Are you the highway strangler?" The denial burst out of me too fast, too sharp to sound honest. "No, God, no, I've never hurt anyone. I'm just trying to get by." Even as the words left my mouth, I heard how hollow they sounded. Everyone says that when they're cornered. Everyone claims they're innocent. He leaned back slightly, studying me with an unsettling calm. "Where were you taking me?" "Ohio," I told him. "That's what you asked for. That's where you paid me to go." He nodded slowly. "And when I told you to pull into this service plaza," he said, "you did it. No pushback, no hesitation, no instinct for self-preservation." He let the silence stretch, forcing the implication to settle. "A normal person," he said at last, "would have been terrified of me." He looked at me the way someone examines a dangerous animal through glass. "Instead, you cooperated." And in the cold morning light, with a gun resting casually in his lap, I realized what he was truly doing. He wasn't just testing my innocence. He was deciding whether I walked out of that parking lot alive. I should have thrown him out the moment he stepped into my car, a stranger on an empty road at 2 in the morning, his clothes damp, his smile wrong, his silence even worse. But I didn't, because a bundle of crisp bills sat between us like a promise I was too desperate to refuse. I kept glancing at that money, thick enough to change a month of my life, maybe 2. And when he asked why I hadn't pulled over, why I'd ignored every warning sign a sane person would have obeyed, I finally said it. I needed help. Not the brave kind, not the heroic kind, the kind you whisper when everything is falling apart. My daughter's school had sent another overdue notice. My landlord had taped a letter to my door telling me I had 10 days left. And the debt collectors, God, they had my number on speed dial. Every ring felt like another reminder that I was slipping, inch by inch, into a place people don't come back from. $10,000 wasn't just cash. It was air. It was a few more nights of sleep, without numbers screaming in my head. Saying it out loud felt like peeling skin off a wound. Because admitting it meant admitting what I'd traded away. My instincts, my safety, my conscience, and maybe justice for someone who didn't deserve mercy. He sat there, listening without a flicker of emotion. Then he held out his hand. "My phone," I asked like maybe I'd misheard. But his hand stayed out, steady and patient. That little rectangle held my entire life. Every message to my kid, every fight with my ex, every job application I'd hoped would fix everything. And the searches, the ones I typed when the house was quiet, and fear sat heavy on my chest like a weight. Searches about disappearing, about vanishing without a trail. about places you can run where no one can drag you back. Not because I wanted to do any of it, but because when you're cornered, your mind wanders into darker rooms than you ever meant to enter. I never went further than reading, but the history was there, ugly, permanent, undeniable. He asked again. This time, I handed it over. He opened my location logs first. Lines and dots, every road I'd ever touched, every forgotten street where I'd waited for the next ride, praying it wouldn't be my last. He zoomed in, studying the pattern of my movements like they were clues. Then he paused, right on the 3-week stretch where my car didn't move at all. The weeks my daughter lay in a hospital bed, pale and hurting, while I sat beside her praying for a miracle. His eyes lifted from the screen, and for the first time that night, I saw recognition, like he'd found the one detail he'd been looking for since the moment he stepped into my car. I watched him skim through the cluster of late-night airport runs I'd done, those quick, frantic rides drivers take when their wallets are starving. He didn't say a word, just traced the pattern with his eyes, nodding every loop, every shortcut, every desperate circle around the terminals. Then he opened my messages. All of them. He read through the fights with my ex, her accusations sharp, my apologies softer than they should have been. Both of us arguing about money, custody, and the endless list of things we could never seem to do right. He read the texts to my daughter too, the ones where I tried to sound cheerful, tried to pretend I wasn't falling apart, the ones where I lied about why I missed her play and her birthday, and so many other things a father shouldn't miss. Then he opened my browser history. I felt my stomach twist as he scrolled. Those searches were landmines, quiet, hidden, waiting to explode. And I braced myself for the moment he found them. But his face didn't shift, not even a twitch. He just kept going, steady and cold, stopping every now and then to look closer. He wasn't judging the individual searches. He was studying the shape of my life, looking for repeated drives to the same dead-end roads, purchases that didn't match my income, searches someone would make if they were planning something final and irreversible, conversations that hinted at complicity or coordination. He was assembling a picture of me, piece by uncomfortable piece. And I let him, because what choice did I have? Eventually, he set the phone down and just stared at me. The silence felt like it weighed 100 pounds. His eyes weren't frantic anymore. They were steady, sharp, trained. The eyes of someone who'd spent years learning how to spot the cracks people tried to hide behind. He told me he'd misjudged people before. That decent men sometimes do terrible, reckless things when the ground crumbles beneath them. And that terrible men often wear the face of someone kind, dependable, harmless. 6 months he'd been chasing this killer, he said. 6 months of theories and patterns and guesses that couldn't stand in a courtroom. His words should have soothed me, but all I heard was uncertainty, which meant I was still on the edge. Still a maybe. Still sitting across from a detective who just watched my entire digital life unfold under his thumb like an autopsy. That was when I broke. Not small tears, no. The kind that rip through you after years of pretending everything is fine. The kind you can't hide, can't quiet, can't push back down. I told him again I wasn't the killer. And I meant it. But I also knew I wasn't innocent, not in the ways that matter. I wasn't someone who ran toward danger to help. I wasn't someone with unshakable morals or clean choices. I was someone who saw what looked like blood and calculated how much the money was worth. Someone who traded pieces of his integrity for a moment of relief. Someone who had become a stranger to himself long before tonight. I wasn't the strangler, but God helped me. I wasn't proud of who I'd become. I told him I was drowning, and for once the word didn't feel dramatic. It felt exact. I opened my photos and showed him my little girl, though he'd already seen everything on that phone anyway. Her school picture glowed on the screen. A missing front tooth, those crooked braids I tried and failed to make look neat. Her smile brighter than anything in my life. She was 10, and she still thought her father was someone worth believing in, someone who chose the right path even when it cost him. I told him I was just trying to keep her fed, keep a roof over her head, keep the lights on. Just trying to survive. I admitted the things I never say out loud, that I was exhausted to my bones, exhausted from deciding whether dinner was optional, from counting every coin to keep the electricity on, from pretending the world wasn't cracking under my feet, from lying to her about why we couldn't go out, why her gifts came late, why I didn't live at home anymore. Truth is, I was tired of being the kind of man who stepped into this nightmare in the first place. He didn't stop me, didn't comfort me, didn't accuse me. He just sat there while the sunrise slowly washed the darkness off our faces, revealing everything that had been hiding in the shadows. His unreadable stare, my tears, the gun resting on his lap like a question he hadn't asked yet. When I finally ran out of words, silence settled between us. Then his expression shifted, barely, but enough that I caught a glimpse of the fatigue beneath his training. 6 months, he'd said. 6 months of baiting traps and watching the desperate stumble into them. 6 months of trying to separate the dangerous from the broken. I wondered how many times he'd sat like this, studying someone, trembling hands, trying to decide whether the fear in their voice was guilt or survival. He said he could see it, that I was tired. Such a small sentence, but it felt like someone finally seeing the truth I'd been dragging behind me for years. He slid the gun back into his coat with a smooth, unhurried motion. And I understood. Whatever trial he'd been running, whatever line between predator and prey he'd been trying to draw, I wasn't going to die in this parking lot. He stepped out of the car, paused, and told me to go home. To go back to my daughter. To keep the money, call it compensation for fear I didn't deserve, or maybe fear I'd earned. But then his tone sharpened. If I was the kind of man who could do one more. If I was sitting there trying to decide whether tonight was my first step across a line that couldn't be uncrossed. I needed to know one thing. He would be watching. Every ride, every turn, every choice. And then he walked away, toward the building, not toward me this time, turning the corner and vanishing like he'd never been there at all. I stayed in the car, staring at the stack of money and the sunrise burning the last darkness out of the sky. People moved around me, living their ordinary lives. Kids yawning, truckers stretching, engines humming. Nothing looked different, but everything felt different. Eventually, I turned the key. The car rolled forward. I didn't make it half a minute before the doubts crawled in, quiet at first, then louder, sharper, heavier. I kept driving, trying to convince myself the uneasy flutter in my chest was normal. Anyone would second-guess things after a night like that. Anyone would replay the conversation, wonder if they'd said too much or too little. The adrenaline was fatting, leaving behind that shaky, hollow fatigue that made every thought feel slippery. But then the doubts sharpened. They stopped being whispers and started growing teeth. I found myself replaying the image of the gun. I tried to picture the serial number I thought I'd seen and realized I couldn't. I remembered the cold shape of it, the way he held it without hesitation, the weight of the threat, but not the details. Not the kind of details that prove legitimacy. Had it even been a police weapon? Or had I just assumed it was because I wanted to believe he was who he said? My mind jumped to the badge. I'd glanced at it, sure, the city seal, the polished metal, the neatly engraved name. It had looked real, but I never touched it, never examined it, never checked the weight or edges or texture. I'd believed it because it was easier than questioning a man with a gun at 2 in the morning. And let's be honest, anyone with cash and a search engine can buy a convincing badge these days. Once that thought hit, the rest unraveled fast. Why would a detective from Philadelphia be chasing a serial killer in New York? Why alone? Why undercover? Why running a one-man operation that sounded like something out of a crime thriller rather than real police procedure? And that planted news article. When I checked it in the gas station bathroom, it hadn't looked fake. The site was real. The formatting was real. The name on the byline belonged to an actual reporter. What if it wasn't planted? What if I'd let a murderer stroll away because he'd wrapped his story in just enough truth to make me swallow the rest? The thought tightened around my ribs, squeezing. I started replaying his face in the headlights, wide-eyed, pale, shocked. Was that an undercover cop pretending to be shaken? Or was it the look of someone who just wiped out an entire family and hadn't yet figured out how to live with it? And the blood on his sleeve, he waved it off, told me it was staged. I'd accepted that because believing it was fake felt safer than the alternative. But had it actually looked fake? Or had I forced myself to see what I needed to see? Then I remembered the call. The one I almost made in the restroom. He'd appeared the moment he realized what I was doing, perfect timing, like he'd been tracking me the whole time. Listening, watching, calculating. Was that a seasoned detective with sharp instincts? Or a predator who knew panic before it was spoken? The questions stacked faster than I could slow them down, and with each one, the world I thought I'd escaped twisted into something darker. Would have kept driving until the map ran out, as long as the bills stopped crushing me and my daughter had milk in the fridge. That realization didn't hit like lightning. It landed slow, heavy, like something old and ugly inside me had finally spoken aloud. I stared through the windshield at the empty rest stop. Sodium lights buzzed, insects tapping against the glass, the highway stretching into darkness like a question I didn't know how to answer. If he wasn't a detective, then who had I taken across state lines? If he wasn't a murderer, then whose blood had stained his sleeves? If he wasn't telling the truth about the family, then why did his voice crack when he said their names? Every version I replayed in my mind made me feel smaller, more trapped, more guilty. The kind of guilt you don't confess, because doing so might unravel your whole life. I lifted the envelope again, thick, too thick. Money that didn't care where it came from. Money that didn't ask questions. Money that had already chosen who I was. I put the car in drive. The decision was quiet, almost gentle. The kind of choice that feels less like choosing and more like surrendering to the person you've already become. I wasn't going to the police. I wasn't going home. I was going to find him. Because now I needed answers, not for justice, not for the truth, but to know exactly what kind of darkness I had let into my car. And even more terrifying, what kind of darkness had awakened in me. The same faint alarm bell ringing in the back of the mind. The same instinct whispering something's wrong. But too softly, too late. Daniel Torres had done what I'd done. He followed the map, trusted the system, believed danger was something that happened to other people. And for that, he paid in blood. I stared at his picture until my vision blurred. That smile, polite, hopeful, the kind you practice for job interviews, felt like a punch to the chest. He looked like every driver I'd ever chatted with in a parking lot, every exhausted man trying to stretch a paycheck far enough to breathe. He looked like me. I locked my phone and sat there, hands shaking around a sandwich that suddenly tasted like nothing. The warehouse break room felt colder, smaller, like the walls knew a secret I wouldn't say out loud. Because now there were only two explanations left. Either the man I'd driven was the strangler, and I had delivered him safely to wherever he needed to kill again, or someone else was out there, hunting the same kind of driver, on the same stretch of highway, guided by the same darkness my passenger carried in his eyes. Both truths were poison. Both truths said the same thing. It could have been me. And every night when I got back behind the wheel, I found myself scanning the rearview mirror with a new kind of fear. Not the fear of who might be sitting in the back seat, but the fear that one night, the luck that spared me would finally be claimed back. I kept replaying the thought that had been clawing at me since the night of my encounter, that same tight, uneasy feeling Daniel must have had before everything went wrong for him. Maybe he hesitated, maybe he tried to get help, or maybe the moment he realized the danger, it was already too late. The news report made it clear the investigation was still active. Detectives said the murderer understood ride-share routines down to the smallest detail, how drivers moved, where they waited, which routes they favored. That line stuck with me, because a stranger had sat in my passenger seat and studied my entire digital life as if he were conducting an audit of my existence. He'd scrolled through my routes, my notifications, my habits. Every mile I'd ever driven glowed on that screen, and now he carried that knowledge with him wherever he actually came from. The police had sworn no one by his name had ever worked in their department. Not now, not ever. So why did he need to know everything about me? Why memorize my patterns as if preparing for something I wasn't supposed to understand? Back home, the money he'd handed me sat mostly spent, rent, groceries, the endless bills that kept piling up like debris in a flood. I tucked $200 in cash into an old shoebox under my bed. I couldn't bring myself to spend it. Couldn't bring myself to get rid of it. Every time I saw it, the same question rose like a bruise. Whose life was tied to that money? Daniel, that family he'd sworn was dead. Or a part of me I'd traded away without realizing what the cost would be. My stomach turned. The sandwich in my hand tasted like cardboard. I tossed it, washed my hands, and went back to hauling boxes through the warehouse until my muscles gave out. But Daniel's picture, that bright smile, the hopeful look in his eyes stayed with me no matter how hard I tried to push it away. Later that night, I broke my own rule and scrolled through the online comments beneath a new article about the killer. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone had a theory. None of them understood. One comment hit me harder than the rest. Drivers take rides from strangers for scraps. They gamble their lives every night. That's the job. As if men like Daniel signed a contract with death. as if any of us had other doors to knock on when life backed us into corners. While I was staring at the screen, my phone buzzed. No name, no message preview, just a number I didn't recognize. I answered, "Nothing." Then breathing, slow, purposeful, listening, measuring. And when the voice finally spoke, it wasn't loud. It was a whisper meant to slip beneath the skin. "Still watching." The call ended. I sat there in the dark, phone shaking in my hand, finally understanding what he'd taken from me that night. Not money, not data, but the last piece of safety I thought I had. I deleted the ride-share app before the fear could talk me out of it. By morning, I'd accepted a graveyard shift stacking cargo in a warehouse. Worse pay, worse hours, but at least the faces around me were real. At least the exits weren't locked behind a stranger's smile. And for the first time since that drive, I could breathe without wondering who was sitting behind me, studying the back of my head in the mirror. Some mornings when I'm heading home and the sky is just turning pale, I pass the first wave of ride-share drivers starting their day. I see them parked under flickering gas station lights, yawning into their phones, swiping to accept rides from people they'll never meet again. And every time, something inside me tightens. I want to roll down my window and warn them, tell them to trust their instincts. Tell them that danger doesn't always walk up wearing a mask. Sometimes it sits quietly in the back seat, smiling like anyone else. But what would I even say? That I once drove a man who might have been a killer, or a cop, or something in between. That I took a stack of bills from him and watched him vanish into the night without ever learning what he truly was. There's no way to say any of that without sounding unhinged. So I keep moving, keep my eyes forward, keep checking the mirror like I'm trying to catch a ghost leaning over my shoulder. That steady warehouse job held me together for 4 months. Predictable hours, no strangers climbing in and out of my car, no creeping dread, but the pay stretched thinner than I expected. Bills piled up again. The credit card company found my number. My daughter brought home a list of school supplies I couldn't afford. One night I sat at the kitchen table staring at my phone. The ride-share app wasn't gone, just sitting in the restore folder, like a temptation built into the device. One tap and I could hustle again. One tap and I'd be right back on those empty roads, trusting the instincts that had already failed me once. I didn't press it, not that month, not the one after. But the thought hovered over me like a shadow I couldn't shake. Half a year after that night, a plain envelope showed up in my mailbox. No name, no return address, postmarked from Ohio. Inside was a newspaper clipping. Another ride-share driver murdered. A suspect arrested. Case closed. Someone completely unfamiliar, a name I'd never heard before, had been caught after his 4th victim. Folded behind the clipping was a small note, written in neat, almost elegant handwriting. The message was short, but it hit like a punch. The writer told me I'd passed the test, that he knew I wasn't the man they were hunting, but I could have been. That was the part that haunted him. And now me. The idea that when people are cornered, when survival feels like a race no one trained for, the line between prey and predator blurs into something almost unrecognizable. He wrote that I'd made the correct choice that night, that letting him walk away had been the answer he needed. He apologized for what had to be done to figure out who I really was. The note ended with a single initial. I burned it, watched the paper crumple into glowing orange and then collapse into black dust in the kitchen sink. But even as the smoke faded, The question stayed with me, whispering its way through the room. What if the offer had been bigger? What if desperation had pushed me 1 inch further? And who would I be right now if I'd taken that step on a dark, empty road? Sometimes I lie awake asking myself the same question he planted in my mind. How far would I have gone if things were even worse? If the bills were heavier, if my daughter's needs were louder, if life had squeezed just a little bit tighter around my throat, would I have crossed a line I can't uncross? At what point does staying alive start to look like helping the very thing you're trying to run from? And when two people sit in the same car, who's really in control? The one with their hands on the wheel, or the one who knows exactly what fear can make someone do? I still don't have an answer. Maybe he knew I wouldn't. Maybe that was the whole point. I don't think he ever cared about catching a killer. I think he wanted to prove that any one of us under the right pressure in the wrong moment could become something we swore we'd never be. He misjudged me that night, but he wasn't wrong about the direction I was heading. And that's the thought that gnaws at me. Not the choice I made, but the choices I was preparing myself to accept. Not the truth of what happened, but the truth it exposed about the man I am when there's no safety net, when the world backs me into a corner and tells me to pick a side. The money's gone now, swallowed by rent, groceries, overdue bills. It vanished so quickly, it almost feels like the whole night evaporated along with it. But every so often, when I'm hauling boxes under the warehouse lights at 3 in the morning, I catch my reflection in a dark window, and for a split second, I see the face I glimpsed in my rearview mirror that night, pale, rattled, hollowed out by choices I didn't even make. I never know which version I'm looking at. The man I was, or the man I almost became. That's when I finally understand what he actually stole. It wasn't innocence. I'd lost that long before in the grind of debt and impossible decisions. What he took was something quieter but far more terrifying. The certainty of knowing, without hesitation, which side of the line I stood on. Ever since that night, every decision feels like a test I didn't agree to take. I moved half a year ago. New city, new job, new routine. I sit in a cramped cubicle now, answering complaints for people I'll never meet. It's tedious work, but it's bright, crowded, predictable, the opposite of the life I left behind. My daughter comes over every other weekend. She laughs more now. Her grades went up. The divorce is settling into something calm. My ex-wife doesn't scream anymore. On paper, I should feel relieved. I should feel like I outran a storm. But I can't stop thinking about Daniel's house. I picture him turning on his ignition that last night, no hint that his shift was a countdown. I picture him making the same silent calculations I made. Which rides seemed harmless, which faces seemed trustworthy, which roads felt safe enough to follow. He never got the warning I did. He never got the chance to walk away shaken but alive. He didn't get a test with a moral answer. He just got in his car. And I got to go home. Whoever that man was, detective, criminal, or something stranger, he followed my trail for a reason. He knew what I needed, what I feared, what number would make me hesitate just long enough to reveal myself. $10,000. That was the price of my silence. The exact amount that made me swallow my doubts and step aside, letting him walk back into the night. And I haven't stopped asking myself since, if the price had been higher or my desperation deeper, what version of me would be sitting here right now? This is haunting in a way that sits deep in the bones, not because of monsters, but because of how honestly it confronts a truth most people try to avoid. You're touching that old, uncomfortable wisdom our elders understood well. A man's real test isn't what he dreams of doing, but what he does when the world corners him and no one is watching. Your writing captures that old world sense of moral weight, the belief that every small choice stacks up, that character is revealed in the dark, not built in the light. Here, what stands out in the most powerful way. You've taken a simple wrong place, wrong time scenario and turned it into a lifelong haunting, not of ghosts, but of conscience. The fear isn't the stranger in the back seat. It's the version of yourself that flickered into existence for a moment and never fully went away. That's a very traditional kind of horror, the kind passed down in quiet stories, warning that a man's soul can be shaken loose by one desperate night. And the way you end it, still searching, still questioning, still unsure which part of you was driving, gives it a sorrow that feels earned. Life moved on. Bills got paid. Jobs changed. Family shifted. But that night stayed like a hidden bruise,